Hello everybody, I'm Kat and I read a lot of books in quarantine. So this is another one of my wrap-up videos where I give my spoiler-free thoughts on books I've recently read. I've been meaning to film this video since April. I usually like to film these videos every like 4 to 6 books I read, but I've read 17. And I have 17 books that I need to talk about in this video. So I'm gonna keep everything brief. I'm gonna give you my general thoughts on the books, and we just gotta keep it going because I have so many books here today that it's kind of insane. Alright, so the first book I read is Dear Martin by Nick Stone. This book follows this 17-year-old boy as he is falsely accused by police of harassing this girl who turns out to actually be his girlfriend. And ever since then, Justice, the main character, decides to write a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. about all of the different black kids that are falsely accused of committing crimes and those who have lost their lives to police brutality because of it, and how it affects not only those people and their families, but how it affects the black community, how it affects the world. This book is so important to read now, and I cannot emphasize enough how much you guys need to read this book if you haven't yet. I gave this book 4 stars. It's absolutely fantastic. This book will break your heart into pieces. It's so moving, it's so emotional. There's no better time to read it than now. So if you have not picked up this book yet, please pick it up. There's a sequel companion novel coming out, I think later this year. Read this book so you're prepared for the sequel companion novel. But this book is so important, and honestly everyone should be reading it right now. The next book I actually reread is Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. This is the first book in the Dark Artifices trilogy, which is the spin-off trilogy to both The Mortal Instruments and The Infernal Devices. So I would highly recommend that you read both The Mortal Instruments and The Infernal Devices before you pick this up. This book follows Emma Carstairs. She's been trying to figure out who murdered her parents and why they were murdered for the past 5 years. And for the past 5 years, she's been researching and trying to figure out how her parents were murdered and who might have murdered them when she finally gets a lead. This series is my favorite series of all time. I started rereading Lady Midnight actually in January, but I don't think I marked it as currently reading on Goodreads until like February. But I listened to this fully on audiobook. I adored the audiobook. I would highly recommend it if you have not ever listened to this audiobook like myself and you're like, hey, I want to read it, or you want to read it for the first time. 10 out of 10 would recommend the audiobook. It was so much fun revisiting these characters and watching them go through and trying to figure out like who this murderer is. It's such a well-crafted murder mystery and it's so well done. I love this book. So I gave it 5 stars. This is no surprise. This was a reread and I had a blast rereading it. The next book I read is actually another book in the Shadowhunter Chronicles, and that is Ghosts of the Shadow Market by Cassandra Clare and a bunch of different authors that I don't fully know. But this is a novella bind-up that takes place like right before the last hours and then after the events of the Dark Artifices. So you get everything in between. You get to learn more about the backgrounds of the last hour characters, which I was so glad I read this before I read Chain of Gold. Otherwise, I would have been so confused. For me, as a TDA stan, I loved seeing what the characters are doing after TDA, and the setup for the Wicked Powers almost made me cry because I was so ready for it. I think my favorite story was the one that takes place during World War II with Tessa and brother Zachariah. I really liked that one. I think that's the only story I gave 5 stars to. I really liked the last story as well. The only reason I didn't give that story like a full 5 star is because of a certain side plot line that if you read it, you know. Honestly, I like to pretend that that last story is the true epilogue of Queen of Air and Darkness, and I suggest you do the same because it's fantastic. But overall, I gave this bind-up 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is one that I'm very excited to talk about, and that is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This book follows the first son of the United States and the Prince of England and their enemies to lovers romance type of thing they have going on here. I was genuinely surprised by this book because it is so overhyped. In the past, books that have been super overhyped on BookTube, I haven't really loved. I was so surprised at how much I genuinely loved this book, and I loved my time with it. The story is so cute and I adored the characters in it, and I just loved everything about it. I would definitely recommend this to anyone who's looking for a romance novel because this book is so cute. This is the first romance novel I've ever read, and I thought it was a good way to kind of get more into the genre. The next book I read is Stargirl by Jerry Spinelli. This book is about a girl named Stargirl who moves into this small town in Arizona. When she moves in, she kind of stirs up the status quo at this high school, and the main character, of course, falls in love with her. So I originally gave this book 3 stars, but looking back, it's more of a 2-star book. I really wanted to love this book more than I did, but sadly it just wasn't for me. The book felt very dated. It felt like I was reading something older. I hated the main character. He was very toxically masculine, which again, this book was written 20 years ago. It just didn't age well. I think if I read this book in like late elementary, early middle school, I would be like the #1 Stargirl stan, and I would be like, this book is my childhood. Kind of like how I am with the Shadowhunter Chronicles, but this book just wasn't it for me, and I think if I read it at a younger age, I might like it more, but even then, I don't really know. The next book I read is Broken Hearts, Fences, and Other Things to Mend by Katie Finn, also known as Morgan Matson, if you didn't already know. This book follows this girl who decides one summer to return to the Hamptons after not being there for 5 years because of a huge falling out she had with her best friend that lived up there, and she returns to the Hamptons with a completely new look than she did 5 years ago, and she ends up faking the identity of someone in order to become closer to the family that she betrayed. I gave this book 4 stars, and it's literally the perfect summer read. You need to read this on the beach, at the pool, eating ice cream, eating a popsicle. Y'all need to read this book. Each character was so unique and so different and so well developed. This book made me appreciate Morgan Matson's writing even more. The plot is a little predictable, but I think most young adult contemporaries are. But personally for me, that didn't take away the enjoyment of the story. You could tell what was coming from a mile away, but I still enjoyed the time it took to get there, you know? So well done, and it was so entertaining. I loved it, and you should too. The next book I read is Sweet Filthy Boy by Christina Lauren. This book follows 3 college girls after their graduation who decide to spend a few days in Vegas, and stuff gets crazy, and all 3 of them end up married to the 3 guys that are rooming in the hotel room next door. Crazy stuff. So this book follows one of the 3 girls, and of course one of the guys, who she ends up married to. This book was just so cute. I gave it 4.5 stars. If you're someone who, again, is new to romance, such as myself, I would definitely recommend this book because the characters in it are younger than in other romance novels. Here, they're fresh out of college, so they're all like 22, 23. This is more of a new adult romance than an adult romance. This book was just so cute, and it made me crave cheese and baguettes. The next book I read is Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. This is Cassandra Clare's latest installment in the Shadowhunter Chronicles. This is the first book in the Last Hours trilogy, which is the spin-off trilogy to the Infernal Devices. So if you're a fan of the Infernal Devices, the main characters in this book are the children of those characters. But this book follows Cordelia Carstairs as she arrives in a quarantined London, sees new demons that have never shown up before, and it's kind of causing chaos in London right now. So this book came out before quarantine hit, but I didn't read it until quarantine. So it was kind of funny seeing Will Herondale yell at the Republican Shadowhunters about, you know, staying safe and, you know, not traveling because we were seeing it in person. Obviously there is a trigger warning for quarantine. Now, of course, it is 1903 Shadowhunters quarantining themselves from like demons and stuff. Different circumstances, but just in case you want to avoid books about quarantines and like kind of virus type things, I just want to put this out there. I gave this book 4 stars. It was an absolute blast. I loved every second of it. I love this cast of characters so much. They're a close second behind the TDA characters for me, and we're only on book 1. I'm so excited for Chain of Iron. But anyway, I have a full review talking about this book with all of my thoughts. So if you want to hear me gush about it for like 17 minutes, that's linked above. The next book I read was The Honeymooners by Christina Lauren. This book follows this girl whose twin sister is getting married. At the wedding, everyone somehow gets food poisoning except for the main character and the best man, who happens to be the person that the main character hates the most. And because they're the only 2 who didn't get sick, the sister decides to give them the honeymoon that she and her husband were supposed to go on because she won it for free and it's non-refundable. The main character and the best man decide to go on this honeymoon trip together for 10 days despite the fact that they absolutely hate each other's guts. I gave this book 4 stars. This book was a blast. I thoroughly enjoyed my time reading it. It's so funny. I actually laughed laughed out loud, like, and I couldn't stop. I've never had a book before where I started laughing out loud so hard that I literally couldn't stop. It was kind of insane. If you're a big fan of The Proposal starring Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds, I would definitely recommend this because this gives off major proposal vibes. The next book I read is Paper Girls Volume 6. This is the final installment in the Paper Girls comic series, which, as you guys know, is one of my favorite series, and I always talk about it here on BookTube. Sadly, this final installment was really anticlimactic in my opinion. I had completely different expectations from where they took the story, and it kind of left me disappointed. The next book I read is Winter by Marissa Meyer. This is the fourth and final installment in the Lunar Chronicles. I'd held off on reading this book from literally even before I started my channel. I was so intimidated by it because despite the fact that this book looks like it's maybe 400 pages, it's actually like 820 or something like that. I had held off on reading this book for so long, but I decided, you know what, I'm gonna read it. It took me a bit to remember everything that happened in books 1 through 3 because I had read books 1 through 3 before this book came out. So I had to like put the pieces together and try to remember everything that happened. This is another series I would avoid reading if you're someone who doesn't want to read books about a virus and quarantine, because that is a major element in this book that I completely forgot about. So just a forewarning, if you plan on reading the Lunar Chronicles, there is a virus and quarantine going on. I fell in love with the land of Luna once again, and Thorn and Cress, and that's all I have to say. I really enjoyed my time with it. This series is just so much fun. Marissa Meyer is such a great author. The next book I read is The Wicked King by Holly Black. This is the sequel to The Cruel Prince, which I actually talked about in my last mini wrap-up. I gave this book 5 stars. This book is my favorite book of the year. That is not a reread. My actual favorite book of the year I'm going to talk about later. This book is my favorite book of the year so far. It was crazy. But first of all, I just want to say that the narrator of the audiobook for this series, because unlike in other series, The Dark Artifices, the narrator narrates all 3 books and she sounds like Kristen Bell, and I'm never over it, okay? And I don't mean that in a bad way because I love Miss Kristen Bell, but the narrator sounds like Kristen Bell and it always kind of shakes me up every single time she narrates. This book absolutely blew me away. I literally read this book within 48 hours because I couldn't stop reading it. The story was so addicting. The characters are everything. I love Juden Carden so much, and that cliffhanger, man. Whew, now I see what everyone was talking about. I was glad we got to explore the merfolk more because they're really fascinating. I don't have any criticisms of this book. I plan on picking up book 3 very soon. This book was so much fun. I had a blast. The next book I read was Love Creekwood by Becky Albertalli. This is a epilogue novella that follows the characters from both Simon vs. the Homo sapiens Genda and Leah on the Offbeat. This novella takes place after the events of Leah on the Offbeat, so I would at least read both Simon vs. and Leah on the Offbeat. The Upside of Unrequited is not a necessary read to read this book, so if you have not read that, but you've read the other 2, you can go ahead and pick this up. Honestly, this book was really pointless and honestly really boring. This book opened up more doors than it actually closed anything. And I honestly kind of regret reading this because the epilogue of Leah on the Offbeat was like the perfect ending to the duology, and this book just like reopened all those doors and like made me question my love for the characters even. It just was not a good time. I gave it 3.5 stars originally, but honestly it's kind of more of a 2.5 star. I was not a fan of this. Personally, if you're someone who is really satisfied with the ending of Leah on the Offbeat, then I wouldn't bother picking this up. But if you're someone who's desperate to see these characters once again, then why not? It's not gonna hurt you, but you may regret reading it later, like I did. The next book I read is Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. This book follows this girl named Hazel and this guy named Josh, and in college they had a few classes together but they never really talked. But Hazel always really wanted to approach Josh and like be his friend. So 10 years later, they happen to meet each other at like a work-related barbecue, and sure enough they reconnect and they become friends. And then they decide, because they've both seemed to be unlucky in the dating game, they both decide that they're gonna go on these random blind double dates together. I give this book 4 stars as well. This book is again super cute. It's another great romance from Christina Lauren, and honestly the only complaint I have about this book is the narrator for Josh. So this book follows dual perspective of both Josh and Hazel, and the audiobook has 2 separate narrators, one for Josh's chapters, one for Hazel's. The girl that narrated Hazel did just fine. Like, I have no complaints about her. She narrated it it perfectly. You go girl, give us everything. But the guy that narrated for Josh would always do this really high-pitched voice for Hazel that sounded like nails on a chalkboard, and it was super annoying, and it made her character seem really annoying in those chapters. But that's the only complaint I had about it. Otherwise, this book was really cute. Alright, the next book I have here is probably the worst book I read all year, and I'm not kidding. I've had a pretty good reading year, but this book kind of made me angry. And that is Alex Approximately by Jen Bennett. So before I get into the summary, I just want to say content warning for PTSD, gun violence, anxiety, and physical violence overall. This book follows this girl who is kind of DMing someone on this online film forum, and they're kind of getting closer and closer. And she knows that this person she's DMing lives in California, but she doesn't tell him that she has also moved to California because that is where her dad lives. And so she spends the book trying to find out who this person is without actually telling him that she is living in the same town as him. Meanwhile, at the same time, she runs into this guy at work who she immediately gets off on the wrong foot with, and they bicker and fight, you know, enemies to lovers, kind of a You've Got Mail vibe at first. So first of all, what the heck even was this book? I went into it expecting that it was the You've Got Mail plot that I just explained, right? Because it even looks cute. Like, look, she's in a pool eating ice cream, or is that popcorn? I can't even tell. It has a cute aesthetic. It sounds adorable. But halfway through, this book had so many graphic scenes of PTSD, violence, and gun violence. And I'm so shocked because I literally hadn't heard anything about this until I actually read it. And so many people love this book, and I've heard so many people talk about it, but no one cared to mention it. The first half of the book just read like a simple young adult contemporary, except I wasn't really attached to the characters and I never really cared for them. That obviously didn't help my case with liking this book, but I ended up skimming the last 250 pages of it because this book sucked. I couldn't be bothered to actually sit through reading it, and the only reason I even bothered skimming the last 250 pages was because I read it for a readathon. So to everyone who recommends this book without giving any sort of content warning, shame on you. Also, shame on the publisher for not putting one. The next book I read is Break Your Glass Slippers by Amanda Lovelace. This is the first poetry collection in a series of new collections that she is writing, and I believe it's supposed to be kind of like a companion to the Women Are Some Type of Magic series that she wrote, which of course has The Princess Saves Herself in this one. But honestly, I gave this book 4 stars. It was so good, and it surprised me at how good it was. I really enjoyed my time with it. Amanda's poetry has truly improved over the years, and this is her strongest work yet. I enjoyed and even connected to some of the poems that she wrote in here, which was so surprising. And finally, the last book I'm about to talk about today is actually another book that I reread this year, and that is Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. To quote a reaction meme I saw on Twitter once, I laughed, I cried a number of times, I sweat, I danced, I got shot, I ate, and I had many epiphanies. But for real, this book is my favorite Shadowhunter Chronicles book to date, and honestly, I don't see anyone ever topping it because this book is literal perfection. I do plan on rereading Queen of Air and Darkness, but I've also had the epiphany that I should actually reread the entire Shadowhunter Chronicles before I get to Queen of Air and Darkness. So, and if you think that's my way of avoiding Queen of Air and Darkness, you're correct. A lot of my complaints about Queen of Air and Darkness stemmed from the fact that I completely forgot everything that happened in this book, because I literally forgot 90% of this book, okay? I literally remembered 3 scenes in this whole book. 3. Only 2 of them were somewhat relevant to the plot, and even then I forgot the plot points. I genuinely went into this not knowing a single thing of what was gonna happen, and it was a grand old time. I did listen to the audiobook, and the audiobook sucks. I have a full review talking about my experience rereading this, so if you want to check that out, that will be linked above, but it was a fantastic reread. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The one thing I do remember from my first time rereading it was that it was very slow, and it was very slow moving, and I think that was a critique that was very popular at the time. But honestly, rereading this was such a breeze. I flew through it. I was addicted to the story. I do plan on rereading all of the Shadowhunter Chronicles, and I'm actually planning on vlogging my experience rereading it, because with books like City of Bones and City of Ashes, I read those in elementary school, and I have not reread them since. And if I forgot what happened in Lord of Shadows, which I originally read 3 years ago, I genuinely don't know a single thing that happened in City of Bones. Like, hello. So I'm planning on vlogging my experience rereading it. If that's something you guys are looking forward to, let me know. If you think I shouldn't vlog it for whatever reason, let me know as well. But I'm really excited about that. But yeah, that is it for this video. Sorry that it's so long because I rambled on about each of these books longer than I should have. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I post videos on Thursdays, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!